great to have you here and great to be here. I would like to thank the Virginia Horse Council and ELCR for inviting me down here from north of the Mason-Dixon line. It's great to be back here in Virginia, and I want you to know that I'm not a stranger to Virginia. As a matter of fact, tonight I'm spending the night at my uncle's house in Orange. But I want to share with you one of my fondest memories of Virginia. In the summer, after I graduated from college, a couple of friends of mine and I ended up working on a farm in Tazewell County. Now, some of you may not know where Tazewell County is, but it's out there in the very southwest part of Virginia. Beautiful, beautiful area. And we were working for a fellow who wasn't very nice. Okay? But he had a father who was absolutely wonderful. He was a real Virginia gentleman, literally right off the bourbon bottle. And we went over to his father's farm one late afternoon, and his father happened to have a Tennessee Walker stallion named Caesar. And I said, I've got to ride that horse. And so I worked out an arrangement with his father where his father would let me have the horse and take it over to his son's farm. So I saddled up Caesar and I started riding off, and we had to ride along the road. And I'm sure you've had the experience where you're riding along a road and your horse likes to turn its head into traffic because they think they own the road. So I put up with that for about half an hour, and then it started getting very dark. So I didn't want to get thrown. So I got down and I held on to Caesar and I walked him for about 2 hours in the dark until we finally got to the farm where I was working. Well, the next day, my boss, who wasn't very nice, said, well, if Tom can ride that horse, I can ride that horse. And so he saddled Caesar up and he starts to mount Caesar, and Caesar was a smart horse, and he tried to roll over on my boss. And unfortunately, he failed, but the long and the short of it is that no one ever rode Caesar again after that event, but at least I did get to ride a Tennessee Walker stallion here in Virginia, which is a very, very fond memory. So my purpose in being here is not to tell you what to do with your land or your communities. These are decisions that you're going to have to make. I'm very excited to be affiliated with ELCR. I very much believe in the mission of keeping land open for recreational horse riding, for breeding horses, and the horse industry is very valuable, not just to Virginia, but to many places throughout the United States. I come from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. One of the things you'll see in my biography is for 9 years I managed the county's farmland preservation program. We're #1 in the nation in terms of farmland preservation. We've preserved almost 100,000 acres in the county, and we have lots of horses in Lancaster County. They're often hooked up to something called a buggy, and if you've ever been to Lancaster, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do this morning is start off with showing you a slide that I show our incoming students every fall to explain to them what planning is really about. And they are warned that, yes, indeed, God hates planners. And so we get rid of about half the incoming class when I show them this slide. The young lady on the left, I think, has a valid statement as well. If you've read as many zoning ordinances as I have, you know that sin and shame is a lot more exciting. And often when I show this slide, I'm asked if these are my daughters. And the answer is no. I have 3 sons, 2 of whom are taller than I am. And I have to look up at them. They're 6'4" and 6'5". And I call them my giraffes. So here's another piece of proof that I'm not a stranger to this part of the world. A few years ago, one of my sons and I were driving through Virginia, and I said, we've got to see the Natural Bridge. And Heather Richards is here from the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, and she's going to talk to you about land preservation. I think this is the first example of land preservation in the state of Virginia, because Thomas Jefferson, as some of you may know, bought the natural bridge from King George III because he didn't want King George III to do something with it that wouldn't last for future generations. You have great heritage here in Virginia. I'm going to be taking Route 15, the journey through hallowed ground up here from Orange up to Gettysburg tomorrow. And you have Manassas, Chancellorsville. But some of the development in Virginia has not been the best. We can say that for many places in the United States. And this is actually the view from George Washington's boyhood home. It's a 7-Eleven and a Shell station. So Virginia has a little over 8 million residents. The population growth in the last census from 2000 to 2010 was 13%, faster than the national average. In 2007, Virginia's agriculture was valued at a little more than $3 billion a year. That's at the farm gate, that's not processed, and that does not include the value of the horse industry. For some reason, when the U.S. Department of Agriculture totals up the value of agricultural production in a county or a state, they do not include the value of the horse industry. And this is an issue that I'm sure many of you have dealt with, is equine agriculture? If you ask me, it is, because you need access to land, you need access to hay, you need access to feed, and you're making use of the infrastructure such as veterinarians. From 2002 to 2007, Virginia lost about 6% of its agricultural land, which comes up to more than 500,000 acres. And Virginia ranks 7th in the nation among the states in the number of horses. So certainly the horse industry is very valuable to Virginia, and Heather actually has some statistics on this to share with you. This is a slide that American Farmland Trust put together several years ago, looking at the high-quality farmland in Virginia in the green and in the red. The red counties are areas where, at least 10 years ago, there was a lot of development pressure as well, and this map may certainly have changed over time. But generally speaking, around Greater Richmond, between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, there is a lot of development pressure in that area, and to some degree here in the Shenandoah Valley as well. From a planning perspective, as many of you may know, Virginia is a little bit special. It's called a Dillon Rule state, and there are 6 Dillon Rule states in the United States, and what that means is local governments in terms of planning are very much, if you will, at the mercy of the state legislature. So they can't do anything unless they have approval from the state legislature to do certain land use planning techniques. Generally speaking, though, in Virginia, you can use comprehensive planning and zoning at the local level, as you'll see. So the guiding document when we do land use planning in public is the comprehensive plan, and this provides a legal basis for any land use restrictions such as zoning. And a comprehensive plan is really supposed to be a blueprint of how a county or a community is going to grow over the next 20 years. And in particular, the land use section is very key, because that will have a map called a future land use map that really shows where development should go and where development should not go. And your future land use map then becomes the basis of the zoning map. The comprehensive plan is very important, and it's also very important to have in the comprehensive plan the value of agriculture, and in particular, the value of the horse industry. Planners, for the most part, are trained in what we call urban planning, and it's one of the biggest frustrations I have as an academic, because all my friends are talking about, cities, and I'm trying to talk about the countryside. And it's very common for planners to look at rural land as quote-unquote vacant land. And fortunately in Pennsylvania, we actually had a ruling from a judge a few years ago that said, no, that's not vacant land, that's developed land called farmland. It's developed as farmland because you have to make certain investments in that land to keep it productive as farmland. Not too many enlightened judges, though, around. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to make the equine industry part of that comprehensive plan and really demonstrate the value of the horse industry to the local economy, the community character, and overall way of life in your community. And I want to just cite for you the example of Montgomery County, Maryland, where in terms of annual farm production, they have maybe $35 million a year. But if you include the value of the equine industry, that industry alone is worth over $100 million a year to Montgomery County. It's a very important part of their local economy. So here's an example of a future land use map. Some of you may recognize this county. This is Loudoun County. I've actually done a little work in Loudoun County. I'm not planning on doing any more work in Loudoun County. A very controversial place to work, as I discovered. But they had a fellow who I met once upon a time come in the late 90s, and the proposal was here in the eastern part of the county, this is where you have, this is Leesburg, and you have Dulles Airport, and you have lots of corporate development in the eastern part and lots of residential development. They said, fine, that's where the growth should go. And then they said, okay, up here in the northern part, we'd like to keep this pretty much open and rural. And of course, down here in the southern part near Middleburg, this is of course the famous Virginia hunt country, and they wanted to keep that open as well. But one of the things that I don't think they took a close enough look at was what were the land use patterns already in place. And this looks at parcels of less than 12 acres, and you can see already the northern part of Loudoun County had been pretty well subdivided into fairly small parcels of land, whereas the hunt country still was pretty open. And so when they came in with some rather strict zoning, what happened was 150 landowners up in this area filed suit against the county, and the county lost, which is always embarrassing for elected officials. So Loudoun County ended up going back to their 1 house per 3 acre zoning, and that's the way it is today. And of course, Loudoun County has been one of the fastest growing counties in the United States over the last 25 years. So I've mentioned zoning. Let me just go into a little bit of detail of what zoning is and what it does. It's really a set of local laws, and its purpose is really to implement that comprehensive plan. And the primary use of zoning traditionally has been to separate conflicting land uses. In cities, it was to separate the factories from where people live, for example. But what we see in rural areas is, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this with your horses, is you'll have people move out to the countryside because it looks nice. And it's fresh air and space. But they don't understand agriculture, and they don't understand horses. And so there are certain different smells you have in the countryside that you don't have in the cities. You might have situations with flies that you don't have in the city. And oftentimes people who move out to the countryside don't like putting up with what's going on their neighboring properties. And they end up in court, which causes a lot of bad feeling as well as a lot of expense. And one of the things that hopefully zoning can do is separate those conflicting land uses. So here's a slide from the Hudson Valley of New York. I used to teach at SUNY Albany years ago. And in the Hudson Valley, they have 2 acre zoning, and they've had lots of houses pop up. And you can see how unimpressed the horses are with the houses next door, because all they want to do is graze and enjoy themselves. So a zoning ordinance consists of two parts, a text and a map, and the text will define types of zoning districts, R1, single-family residential, R2, multifamily, C1, commercial, A1, agriculture. And each district will spell out what land uses are allowed in that district. For example, is boarding horses allowed in this district? How many units per acre you can put on, one house per 3 acres, one house per 5 acres. Building heights, setbacks of buildings from property lines, and lot coverage, how much of a lot you can cover in impervious surface. And then you'll also have uses that are permitted by right. If you're in a, say, A1 agricultural area and you want to build a horse barn, that should be permitted by right, in my opinion. What would be a special exception? Well, are you going to, do something that would have an impact on your neighbors? Say if you wanted to board more than 20 horses, something like that. Would that be allowed? Well, it could be, but you might have to get a special use permit to do that. And then a conditional use would be something like somebody coming in and proposing a landfill next to you, which is a huge change in land use that would have to be approved by the elected officials. And then finally, the map, the zoning map, as I'll show you, shows the location of these different districts. This is the township that I actually live in, and I live down here in the residential area. But what's very nice is we have a major road here that separates our residential area from this agricultural area here. So we have some industrial uses down here. We have some residential uses zoned in these different colors. And we have this wide open area that's zoned for agriculture as well. So we've done, I think, a pretty good job of separating our agricultural area from our developed area, and certainly having a major road. This is basically a divided interstate type highway, and we don't have any sewer lines that are going north of there. So that works pretty well for us. This is an example of a community in New York that I worked with over the past couple of years. It's called the town of Ogden. It's just outside of Rochester. And they actually have a fairly impressive agricultural industry there as well. And the planner that I worked with did some very nice mapping. First he said, okay, where's the farmland owned and where's the farmland rented? And throughout the United States, the average is farmers rent about 40% of their land. So there's some tension there. Is that rented land going to be available from year to year? And it's often very important to keep that farm going, to have access to that rented land, and it's a heck of a lot cheaper than buying it. And this is the future land use map for Ogden. They'd love to keep this whole area open and in agricultural use. And then we looked at their zoning, and what this white area means is that it's all zoned for 1 acre lots. And you can see what's happened is everybody's been carving off little building lots along the road frontage because that's what the zoning allows. And what you don't see here is they actually have water lines going all through this area, and they're just using on-site septic to dispose of their sewage. So the road frontage is virtually all stripped off, and you're actually creating situations where you have people now moving out into this area that you'd like to keep agricultural. They're out there just to be, living there, and the potential for conflicts with their farming neighbors, I think, is significant. Let me talk just briefly about the legality of zoning. I know property rights is a very important issue in this country, and zoning is legal as a way to protect the public health, safety, and welfare under the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. The 5th Amendment, however, says that a regulation can go too far, and that if government actually takes property government has to pay just compensation to landowners. The legality of zoning was upheld, in this case, way back in 1926, as a valid use of the 10th Amendment police power. And the Penn-Cole case in 1922 said a regulation can't go too far and basically take away all economic use of the property. And when that happens, government does have to pay compensation or rescind whatever regulation is in place. So we have this tension legally between, yes, zoning can reduce the value of land. You can zone land from 1 house per acre to 1 house per 5 acres, as long as it's makes sense to do that, if it's reasonable. And a reasonable economic use remains of the property, but you cannot take away all economic use of the property. And that tension is going to continue with us well into the future. So let me give you some rural zoning examples here in Virginia. I'm currently part of a team that's competing for a job in Prince William County, Virginia. I'd like to do work in Virginia. And we're looking at their 80,000 acre rural crescent. And it's remarkable that there's that much land that's fairly open, that close to Washington, D.C. And they've used a 10 acre minimum lot size for several years now. And they'll use a 3 acre minimum if the development is clustered. So, for example, if you owned 100 acres and you're zoned 1 house per 10 acres, you can create 10 10-acre lots. Or if you cluster the development and keep at least half the land open, you can put 33 houses on that 100 acres. Loudoun, even though it has experienced a lot of growth, is the #2 horse county in Virginia, and they have that 3 acre minimum lot size that I mentioned earlier. Fauquier County, which is the #1 horse county, has a 2 acre minimum lot size. And a good friend of mine, someone I've known for over 20 years, a fellow named Ray Pickering, is the head of their farmland preservation program in Fauquier County. Let's look at some horses, finally. This is actually a slide that I stole from Denise. This is Lexington, which is a beautiful area. If you haven't been there, you need to go there. It is horse heaven. And Heather's going to talk about the work of the Piedmont Environmental Council and others. These green dots here throughout the county, these are preserved lands where landowners have either donated or sold the development rights to their property. And that's a strictly voluntary program, and you have a wonderful state credit for donating conservation easements that Heather will talk about in more detail. So there's lots going on in the Shenandoah Valley to protect the land base over the long term, and that's really quite impressive and very positive for horse people. Let me give you one example of how horse people can get involved and really influence the process, because I really want you to get involved, because now you really do have to get involved because of the scale and the scope of development that's happening. And this is a place called La Habra Heights in California. It's in Los Angeles County. And some planning consultant came in who obviously didn't really understand horses very well and proposed some change in the standards. And they were going to reduce the number of permitted large animals from 8 per acre to just 2 per acre. Well, what would that do for people who owned horses? In addition, they wanted to increase the setbacks for stables and riding rings to 50 feet from a property line from 25 feet. And the horse owners were strongly opposed to this change. And so what they did is they attended the Planning Commission, the Piedmont Environmental Council, and others. These green dots here throughout the county, these are preserved lands where landowners have either donated or sold the development rights to their property. And that's a strictly voluntary program, and you have a wonderful state credit for donating conservation easements that Heather will talk about in more detail. So there's lots going on in the Shenandoah Valley to protect the land base over the long term, and that's really quite impressive and very positive for horse people. Let me give you one example of how horse people can get involved and really influence the process, because I really want you to get involved, because now you really do have to get involved because of the scale and the scope of development that's happening. And this is a place called La Habra Heights in California. It's in Los Angeles County. And some planning consultant came in who obviously didn't really understand horses very well and proposed some change in the standards. And they were going to reduce the number of permitted large animals from 8 per acre to just 2 per acre. Well, what would that do for people who owned horses? In addition, they wanted to increase the setbacks for stables and riding rings to 50 feet from a property line from 25 feet. And the horse owners were strongly opposed to this change. And so what they did is they attended the Planning Commission meeting and they voiced their opposition. And they pointed out, they did their homework, they were very smart. They did their homework and they pointed out that this proposal violated the local general plan, the local comprehensive plan, and specifically the goal that said protect, preserve, and enhance the residential, rural character and individual lifestyle in the community. And the Planning Commission agreed. I mean, it was there in black and white. So the lessons that are important from the La Habra case are this. Land use planning is a legal process, but it is also a political process. You have to attend public meetings and you have to make your voice heard. It helps to be organized, and in the La Habra case, they were organized. They had many horse owners that came to the meeting and spoke. They did their homework, they read the local comprehensive plan, they understood the zoning ordinance, they understood the proposed changes, and they were polite, but they were forceful. And as far as I could tell, they kept their cool. If you go to a public meeting and you blow your stack, you're not going to win, okay? You're not. So, again, don't wait until it's too late. Understand the structure of the planning process. You have elected officials who you certainly can call up and contact. You have members of the Planning Commission who you can contact as well. It's also helpful to have a sense of what your state planning and zoning enabling legislation is. You don't necessarily have to hire an attorney to do that. You can read it yourself and understand what is permitted or not permitted under state statute. I want to talk just briefly about 2 kinds of agricultural zoning, and you want to have agricultural zoning that's horse friendly. And I think that's another lesson from the La Habra case. You want to state in the purpose clause of the zoning ordinance that the purpose is to maintain the horse industry and to maintain property rights and to maintain access to land. If you want to be really strict with what I would call an A1 agricultural zone, you're looking at something like a 20-acre or maybe a 40-acre minimum lot size. In Lancaster County, where I live, we have 2 kinds of agricultural zones. We have a 1 to 25 zone, and we also have a 1 to 50 zone. Those are very strict agricultural zones. They work pretty well for us. We do have some rural residential development, but the decision is, in many cases, really up to the landowner whether he or she wants to exercise those rights. So what we have in Lancaster is this what we call fixed area ratio. So it's 1 house of no more than 2 acres for every 20 acres. And in this example, what that would mean is if you owned 100 acres, you could subdivide 5 building lots a total of 10 acres, and you'd still have 90 acres remain for the farm operation. And that has worked pretty well for us in Lancaster. You want to set standards for setbacks for barns. Is it 25 feet from property lines? Is it 50 feet? You know, what makes sense? What can landowners live with? And oftentimes, as in the La Habra case, you have an outside consultant come in and just say, oh, well, I'm going to create these standards. And they do that without actually talking to the landowners. And that's why it's very important if there's any changes to your zoning ordinance that you really need to speak up as horse owners to say, okay, can I live with this, or what can I not live with? And really make your voice heard. And we often have this issue of what is a commercial horse operation. And there was an example in Ipswich, Massachusetts, where somebody came in, and this was really the fault of the landowner, and he just wanted to make it bigger, 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 bigger. And finally the neighbors said, okay, what's going on here? What's commercial? And in this case, commercial breeding operations were not allowed in the zone. And the landowner ended up in court and frankly embarrassed in the process. Manure removal, I think Willie Wood is going to talk a bit about this, which is a very important issue. And I think you also want to have in your zoning ordinance exemptions from height limitations for barns and structures. Certainly, silos are very common on farms. Some horse barns like to have cupolas, which can maybe go higher than the usual 35 feet, and that's fine. It's certainly attractive, but you want to make sure that you have that exemption in your zoning ordinance. A less strict agricultural zone would be what I would call an A2, agricultural residential zone. Agriculture is permitted, but it's often an area that is in transition, and you're going to probably have more residential development in that area over time. Again, you want to spell out why you're allowing horses in this A2 zone. Your minimum lot sizes tend to be rather small, between, say, 2 acres and 5 acres minimum lot sizes. There may be a clustering option, as in the case of Prince William County. And some A2 zones are set up to be what are called equestrian overlay zones. And that's just on top of the underlying agricultural residential zone. And it's a way of ensuring to landowners that, yes, horse ownership and horse uses are permitted in this zone, and we especially actually want to see them happen in this zone. You will often have that issue of how many horses you can have per acre. What is the maximum that makes sense? Again, setbacks for barns from property lines. And a bigger issue, though, in these A2 zones is whether and where horses can be stabled or used for business purposes, such as boarding, training, lessons, and other things. And if you really have people who are doing a lot of these things in an area, make sure you're allowed to do it in the zoning ordinance, okay? Because otherwise, somebody else is going to be making that decision for you. And then finally, take care of your manure. Okay. So one of the problems that we see with proponents of strict zoning, and I think they saw this in northern Loudoun County, is that there already had been a considerable amount of development in the countryside. And the downzoning from 1 house per 3 acres to 1 to 20 was significant, and people had, basically had expectations of the value of their property at 1 house per 3 acres. On the other hand, this rural residential sprawl that we see in many places has really led to a lot of expectations about what a property is going to be worth. And a lot of people have a lot of their wealth tied up in their property. So let me give you some closing thoughts here, and that is, good neighbors, as Robert Frost once said, are the result of good fences. Actually said, good fences make good neighbors. So don't forget that. You really want to educate non-horse neighbors about your horse operation. I have a good friend in Lancaster who I worked with on preserving a couple of his farms, and he runs an 800-head dairy operation, and he has 43 neighbors. And he has very good relations with those neighbors. He's very careful, and I've even heard of one farmer, what he does is he has many neighbors, and what he does is he has a barbecue once a year and invites all the neighbors over. And it's a way of explaining, keeping the relationships, with the neighbors, and also explaining, or even giving them a tour of the operation. This is what I'm doing here, these kinds of things, because that can help you. Believe me, it can really help avoid a lot of problems, and certainly keep you out of court, which is very expensive. Maintain your property. Your property is a form of advertising about your personality and who you are. Believe me, you want to avoid going to court. There are too many lawyers in this country, and I'm sorry if there are any in the audience that I'm offending by saying that. I know because my brother is an attorney, and I've been trying to put him out of business for years. He's actually a tax attorney, and he's kept me out of jail for years, so I'm grateful to him. And finally, horse people, the more you organize, I know landowners, rural landowners, are very independently minded people. They're very good people, very proud people. And I want you to know that you, as horse owners and landowners, you are very important people, because you really hold the future of your communities in your hands. And I'm just thrilled that you're here today, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. I'm not familiar with the Occoquan case, and I'd be very interested to talk with you about that. The family conveyance issue is something that we have not dealt with in Pennsylvania. I've done some work in Maryland where they also have that family conveyance option, and I have to say there's been a fair amount of abuse of that as well. And I don't think that's the wisest way to draft a zoning ordinance myself. I mean, if you want to just say you're allowed X number of subdivisions, you can do it that way, or you're allowed a standard of one house per 10 acres or one house per 5 acres. But trying to keep track of are you selling it to a cousin, an uncle, a nephew, whatever, that becomes a record-keeping nightmare, I think. Thank you for that question.
Other questions? What does your uncle think of Orange County's comprehensive?
I think I'm going to find out this evening. I haven't seen him in a couple of years, so I'm sure going to bring me up to speed on that. But one plug I want to make, again, for Heather's organization, and PEC has a listserv where once a week they send out an email